Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome today. We are going to learn together about Apex coding for admins. If you are an administrator, you have no knowledge of how to write Apex code, this presentation is for you, where all admins can become all-powerful in Salesforce and Apex. You are about to experience a huge power spike. So let's start and join me as we will discuss about Apex coding for admins. But before we start, let's talk about my favorite topic, me, myself, and I. So for people who don't know me, I'm Houssam SAOUDY and I work at Capgemini, Morocco as a Salesforce technical lead. This means I'm also a senior developer with a deep knowledge of the Salesforce ecosystem. I understand how to use CRM technology to transform a business, accomplishing specific goals and achieving critical outcomes. I've written a lot of Salesforce code for a lot of customers around the world. And let me just say, I love what I do. I'm also a Salesforce MVP, the very first Salesforce MVP in Africa, which means basically I'm fully involved in the Salesforce ecosystem and the Trailblazer community. And I share my knowledge with three languages, Arabic, French, and English. I have 10 Salesforce certifications, including platform developer and application architect, my favorite one. I'm also leader of the Casablanca, Morocco developer group, the very first Trailblazer community group in Africa, and I'm very proud of this. I'm also a North Africa Dreaming founder, and I deliver a lot of presentation around the world with user groups. And this is my handle Twitter. You can add me on Twitter. Now let's talk about our agenda. Here is an overview of the topics we will cover during this session. First, I will teach you about all the tools available to you in Salesforce for automating business logic. You have many declarative and programmatic tools, and it's important for you to know when to use each. We are going to answer the question, when should you code and when you should not, and where you can use Apex. After that, I'm going to give you an overview of Apex triggers, what they are, what they work, with a simple example. We will also talk about the coding editors needed to write Apex code. Finally, I will give you a demo to know how to write Apex and some resource to learn more about Apex code. By showing of hand, how many of you have ever used workflow rule? Okay, we are virtually, but you can put your answer in the chat. So let's start by reviewing the declarative automation tools that we have in Salesforce. Declarative means that we can use our mouse to leverage these tools. No coding required. We need to discuss this because in my experience, a lot of developers code because they don't properly understand the declarative tool set. There are so much that we can be done in Salesforce with these declarative automation tools. So now let's take a look at what we have in our toolbox. The first and the most commonly used admin tool is the workflow rules. And now let's talk about the good and the bad about workflow rules. First, it's easy to use. It's simple tool. It's a simple tool. It's very intuitive. It's the original tool that started point and click automation in Salesforce. Workflow can automate many business processes and can access most standard and custom objects in Salesforce. A workflow rule does two things well. First, it's great at doing some object field updates. And the second, the workflow rules are also good at sending out email notifications. The best part about workflow rules is they are easy to set up and they have rock solid reliability. Now, let's look at the downsides of workflow rules. Workflow rules can do just four things. It can create a task, send an email, update a record, or send an outbound message to another software application. It cannot create or delete records. Workflow rule can only be invoked when a record changes. The save button must be engaged either on created or edited of records. Also, you have no control over execution order of workflow, and it only supports one if-then statement. For many users, that causes a lot of workflow rules to have. And if we have a lot of business needs, you should create more workflow rules. Also, workflow is limited in associated objects that it can access. It can only access some fields on related master objects. So that's workflow, the good and the bad. Now let's talk about the process builder. The process builder is a good way to start, and it supports more actions than workflow rule, just as creating shutter posts, updating child records, and creating records. It also supports versioning. You can control the order or execution with a nice drag and drop interface in Process Builder, and it supports multiple if-then statements. You can create all the logic branches that you wish and order them as you wish. Process Builder can be invoked by changes in the record just like workflow, but also by another process. Process Builder can update any record, regardless of whether the objects are related with a lookup or a master detail relationship. So overall, Process Builder is far more powerful than workflow. And since workflow will not get any further enhancements, people should be using Process Builder. And the bad about Process Builder, the Process Builder can create records, but you can't grab the ID of the newly created record and do something with it. Process Builder does not support user interaction also. You can't display a screen and run the process based on a user input into that screen. And now let's talk a little bit about flow, the bad and the good. So the good about flow, it does all actions that workflow rule and process builder do and more. We can invoke by custom buttons, link or processes. We can create, update or delete any records. We can also call other flows. The bad thing about flow, we need to learn flows, and it's difficult to do all business logic with the flow. Sometimes we have some limitations. And now let's talk a little bit about the coding toolset. Oh yes. Now on the good stuff, let's talk coding technologies. There are two general types of coding technologies. Even if you are on the Salesforce platform or not, the first is backend code. Backend code is automation that happens on the database level, meaning this type of code typically manipulates Salesforce records and fields. There are three programming constructs in Salesforce that deal with backend code, but all three generally fall under the Apex code name, and all three are commonly used together at the same time. And the second type of code is front-end code. We can work with Visualforce, Lightning components, or Lightning Web components. For Visualforce, it's a web development framework that enables developers to build sophisticated custom user interfaces for mobile and desktop apps that can be hosted on the Lightning platform. You can use Visualforce to build apps that align with the styling of Lightning experience, as well as completely custom interface. And as I said, we have also the Lightning component framework. The Lightning component framework is a UI framework for developing web apps for mobile and desktop devices. It's a modern framework for building single page applications with dynamic, responsive user interfaces for Lightning platform apps. It uses JavaScript on the client side and Apex on the server side. The third one is the Lightning Web Component. The Lightning Web Component is the newest front-end coding language, and it lets you build applications that follow the new Lightning style UI. It's much more modern, and it's also much faster. Now let's talk about when and when not to code. You should consider this first. When you want to build a new features or new functionality, you should ask yourself this question. Is development really needed? If no, you should refuse to write Apex code and build a solution with declarative tools. After that, you need to answer this question. Can I build this feature declaratively? That's mean with workflow rule, process builder, or flow. If yes, then ask yourself, is the declarative solution really complex? If no, you should build this feature declaratively with workflow rule, a process builder, or flow. And after that, you need to test your functionality. And after that, you deploy on production. But if the declarative solution is really complex, or we can't build a declarative tools, so what we need to, so stop and think about building with a code. Think about building this solution, this feature with Apex code. And we can see, use Apex when you need more functionality than is available in process builder or flow builder. So now let's look at some of the places where Apex is still the way to go. We can write Apex code on triggers, for example, when we want to execute whenever a database operation is performed, such as a record is added, regardless of what caused the operation. Also, batch jobs, and when we have complex logic. Also, we can write Apex when we need to build web services, and when we have a complex logic, and more. So today, let's talk, and now let's talk about triggers, because I think why we need to discuss and start with triggers, because triggers are the simplest starting point. You can write a basic trigger easily with a minimal amount of knowledge. Also, because triggers are the natural building blocks for learning other Salesforce languages. Once you learn triggers, you are automatically going to need to know about SOCL queries, then Apex classes, and finally, Visual Force, Lightning components, and Lightning Web components, etc. So what is a trigger? According to Wikipedia, a database trigger is a procedural code that is automatically executed in response to certain events, blah, 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 blah. You can read more in Wikipedia, but according to the Apex Developer Guide, a trigger is a Apex code that executes before or after the following types of operations: insert, update, delete, merge, upsert, and delete. And now let's talk about what is a trigger in admin terms. Triggers are like workflows, process builders, and flows, but only created via code. They do specific things to specific records when you tell them to. So let's look at the way that triggers are structured. So we have here our syntax, the basic syntax. Here we have the name of our trigger. Here, which object. And here we will put when you want to the trigger to run. For example, before update, after insert, after delete, etc. Here is an example of hello world trigger on account. We will run this code when an action on this object account. For example, before insert, when someone insert an account, I can run this code. And I have many actions, for example, before insert, before update, before delete, or we can run our trigger after execution. For example, after insert, after update, after delete, and after in delete. But there are two ways to write triggers. We have the best practice and the common practice. Let's talk a little bit about the best practice. The best practice is when our trigger calls out the one or two more classes, and this class contains the code that does stuff. and the common practice when trigger contains all the code that does stuff. Today, I will present for you the common practice because it's easy to learn first for admins. But when you become more familiar with Apex, you can use the best practice. We are going to start off with a classic example. Now, let's me go through this trigger line by line and explain what is going on. The first line in this trigger describe the name of my trigger. And after that, what object it's running on. The object we type here tells Salesforce that it should fire our trigger whenever events happen on this object. When event fires this trigger, we type a comma separated list of events that will fire our trigger. The three main types of events are insert, update, and delete. The before tells Salesforce to run this trigger right before the account is updated, or in my example, before the account is updated or insert, sorry. So to summarize, the first line will be creating a trigger name, hello account trigger, on the account object and before insert. Moving on the second line, we have what I call the trigger loop. Multiple records could enter a trigger at once. For example, multiple accounts could be inserted in bulk. This trigger loop repeats all the code inside its brackets for each possible records. Each lane in this loop is temporarily assigned to a variable we are going to name a trigger.new. It's the list of all accounts in this trigger. Each lead in this loop is temporarily assigned to a variable we are going to name a trigger.new. We are setting fields on the account using a format that may be familiar to you. Just as we would with formula fields, we can access the fields of a record using dots. Remember, A is the variable we are assigning to the current account in our trigger loop. So we are setting a dot description to hello Trailblazer community. And we repeat this for every account in our trigger. Now let's talk about where to write the code. The first thing you need to do is choose your coding editor. This is where you are going to write all your code. The first coding editor available to you is the developer console. The developer console is an integrated development environment where you can create, debug, and test apps in your org. The developer console is connected to one org and is browsed based. If you want your changes to be effective immediately and you don't want to install anything on your computer, I recommend the developer console. The second coding editor that I will recommend for you or to you is Visual Studio Code. And as a developer, it's important to have the best tools to get your job done. For this reason, Visual Studio Code is the best coding editor out there. You can install Visual Studio Code on many computers running Macintosh, Windows, or Linux. The system requirements are fairly small, so it should run on just about any machine. Use it if you want to connect to multiple orgs, compare or synchronize files, or use version control. The Salesforce extensions for Visual Studio Code is your best option. But I recommend the developer console for you, for admins who just want to start to write code because it's more easy for them. The developer console has all the features we need to start to write Apex code. Okay. Now let's see a demo. Here I am in a refresh new Salesforce development environment. I'm going to write a trigger using developer console. To go there, click on the setup icon and click on the stop icon. Then developer console to start your trigger. Hit file, new Apex trigger. I will put my name, the name of my trigger. Hello, account trigger. After that, I can choose my object, account. So here I have my line. So the developer console can generate for me this line. After that, I can write my loop for each loop. For account A trigger that new. After that, A dot description equal and I can write a phrase, for example, hello Trailblazer community. So I register my code. So now let's see my execution or my demo. So I will create a new account. So I click on new button and I will insert a new account. For example, London's calling. So I click on save button. After that, I can see London's calling account was created, but also my description. I write a phrase, hello Trailblazer community in my description. So this is what my trigger do. Now we have another example of trigger. So I created a new trigger. The name is contact trigger on the contact object. And this trigger will execute after insertion. And what I want my trigger do, I want to create a new case, a simple case. And with a subject, send a free London calling t-shirt with a priority very urgent. And I will associate this case to my contact. So this is my syntax. It's the same, just I instance my object case handle C equal new case. After that, I fill the subject priority and contact ID. After that, I insert my case. We can see a demonstration about that. So go to the developer console, file, new, Apex trigger. I can write the name of my trigger, contact trigger. I will choose the object, contact, submit. So I can now start by writing my code. As I said, the first line, it's automatically generated. So I put my code here. I register my trigger. After that, let's see a demo of what happens when I want to create a new contract. So I will write my names here, my first name, my last name, and I click on Save button. After that, I can see my unrelated lists. My cases was created automatically. So with a very urgent priority and send a free London calling t-shirt as a subject of my case. So this is just two examples what we can do with the Apex code with the triggers. So you can do more with Apex and triggers. So now let's look to some resources we have on Trailhead. There are many resources on Trailhead mod. We have models and also projects to learn more about Apex code. Here is my recommendation for you. You can choose Apex basics for admins to start, SOCL queries for admins, Apex triggers, Apex basics and database, and more. So Trigger or Trailhead is your friend. So thank you for your attention. I really appreciate that you are here today. I hope I help admins understand how to write Apex code. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write on the chat or send me a message on Twitter. So thank you very much.